Welcome back, everyone, to Pontos Fathom Press. Today we're going to talk about our book review of Dune Revenant, which is Dune Revenant began as a fan fiction to complete Frank Herbert's Dune saga. In the early days of Usenet Internet, before the sequel and prequel novels, Dune fans would discuss fan theories and speculate on the then mythic notes of Frank Herbert's unwritten seventh Dune book. Now, 25 years later, Dune Revenant stands as one of several fan attempts to follow the visionary inspiration of Herbert's Dune saga. So the idea here is just a little background. If you're Dune fans, you know well that Frank Herbert originally wrote Dune in the early 60s, and he went on to write a number of sequels: Dune Messiah, Children of Dune, God Emperor of Dune, Heretics of Dune, and Chapter House Dune. Before he passed away. And Chapter House Dune kind of ended on a cliffhanger. And back in the day at the time, in the early internet days, there was lots of Usenet speculation on what was Frank Herbert going to write in his seventh Dune book. Lots of early HTML web pages, FAQs exploring Dune 7. And so that was the inspiration of writing Dune Revenant. Dune Revenant came out of that time of just really wanting a fan fiction to complete the saga. And then all of that kind of internet chat and research that went on kind of inspired somewhat the creation of Dune Revenant. So that's the origin of the book in a nutshell. But then, however, there was time went on and the extended Dune universe came about. And different prequels, the House Atreides, Harkonnen trilogy, the Machine War, Butlerian Jihad trilogy, and some of the interstitial books more recently. But there was a 2-volume version of the quote-unquote seventh Dune book, which was Hunters of Dune and Sandworms of Dune, and that kind of was the Brian Herbert, Kevin Anderson wrap up of the official canon, extended universe canon, let's call it, of the Dune saga. But there was always this sort of, as that was unfolding, there was always sort of like fans of Dune Revenant out there, and this whole sort of feedback there. So really, the Dune Revenant itself as a book, we've got it on paperback and printed in hardcover. And it's really just a collection of three parts. There's a number of introductions over the years that came out from different periods of revisiting it. There's the text of Dune Revenant itself, which in a way is an unfinished fan novel. But then there is an appendix with lots of reproduction of those early blogs and different internet writings talking about Dune Revenant's creation, some people who had read Dune Revenant, and then there's an interview with Frank Herbert that was included in Vertex magazine, and then some notes from the notebooks of creation of Dune Revenant. So maybe what I'll do is to start us on the Dune Revenant journey here. I will just read a little bit from the introduction of the book and maybe the first chapter. So I will start with the first introduction. So the introduction to the 20th anniversary edition is a good enough place to start. And last year I watched the superlative documentary Jodorowsky's Dune, and it was this film's secondary title, The Greatest Dune Movie Never Made, that reminded me of the coming 20th anniversary of Dune Revenant. Except in the case of this little fan fiction, the secondary title is more like the greatest Dune 7 fan fiction never finished. So after all these years, Dune Revenant remains in that proto-novel state, and watching the Jodorowsky film had me asking questions how many interpretations and incarnations of Frank Herbert's Dune universe could stand the test of time. Of course, Frank's books are still the classics, and they have been since the 1960s. A friend of mine recently told me he was rereading God Emperor of Dune for the nth time, and I mentioned the Dune Saga hardcover collection. All published originally are editions of Frank Herbert's Dune, Dune Messiah, Children of Dune, God Emperor, Heretics of Dune, and Chapter House Dune. But then there, even across the world, you can find copies of Dune in every bookstore and the sequels, you know. The original saga stands the test of time. The prequels, sequels, and now interstitial books from Brian and Kevin, well, in general, have not aged as well, but there's loyal fans to those because it was a new generation. And their Dune 7, the 2-volume Hunters of Dune and Sandworms of Dune, were actually some of the best works of Brian and Kevin. I mean, these books really showed that they had matured a lot in their writing. And again, perhaps fueled by those infamous Dune 7 notes we kept hearing about. And also there are things of Paul of Dune that are interesting. There are things, because it takes place between Dune Messiah and Children of Dune, there's a lot of interesting places to explore there. So you got to give the guys credit for really doing a job of at least exploring the universe, right? And obviously there's going to be fans who don't like that, and they're classic Frank's fan, but there's just as many fans who like it. I wonder if Quinn's ideas, I haven't seen his prequels books, but I'm sure Quinn's ideas probably is, he's kind of the completest on YouTube these days. So hey, if you guys have a comment, or Quinn, if you're watching, let me know, like maybe we can talk. So I must confess the weak treatment of the later Dune, the Butlerian Jihad books had scared me off. Yeah, the idea of the machines and the Butlerian Jihad was a bit scaring, off-putting, but things were looking up for the expanded Dune universe. The film versions that were made, while not as good as at least potentially the best film never made, were David Lynch's Dune, and also, which is a classic, and then the Sci-Fi Channel's 2 miniseries, Dune and Children of Dune. So the movies brought the Dune saga to yet another generation, expanding Frank's saga in a parallel cinematic way. Hey, leave a comment below. What was your favorite Dune period, Dune book, Dune movie, even Dune video games? I had played all the Dune video games as well. I remember there was the Dune real-time strategy game that was awesome, and there was the Dune kind of a playthrough old PC game that was great. Hey, on our other channel, pontos, fathom, hobbies, I'm doing a playthrough of the Gale Force 9 Dune game, which I really enjoy. So you guys check that out as well. And what of Dune Revenant? Does the half-written fan fiction hold a place in the still rapidly expanding Duneverse? A quick search for Dune Revenant shows 28,000 pages and even 2.5 stars out of 5 on Goodreads. Not bad for an unfinished fan fiction. Or as one review soberly critiques, and I quote, Dune Revenant fan fiction, not great. Still, Dune Revenant has its fans. I recently sent a copy to a Dune fan in Hawaii and another one in Guam. One thing is for certain, Dune is popular in the islands. Thank you, Frank Herbert, for getting me into the shore and seeing me off to sea. Back to the introductions. I'm just going to go back to the first introduction. It says, Dune Revenant began as far back as 1996 in notebooks inspired by the many sources. Of course, the original Dune books by Frank Herbert. The internet of the 1990s also contributed a great deal. As a frequent Usenet reader and contributor to the alt-fan Dune newsgroup, I shared ideas and inspiration for Dune 7. This was the first of final drafts. I think the final time any words were added to it was in 1999. So this edition collects various comments, emails about the Dune Revenant collection from the past history, from countries and contributors from America, Russia, Italy, France, Trinidad and Tobago, Germany, Netherlands, and Japan, to name a few. Also collected in this edition are some facsimile pages, original notes, and concept art for the Dune Revenant. So there's also the original FAQ, the Dune 7 FAQ here. Again, as a fan fiction, it's just marking the time that there was. The only question would be, what would Frank have written had he completed his saga? And a fan's version of that work standing to answer the question. So maybe just, again, as another insight, I will just read chapter 1 from Dune Revenant. 2525 AG. The present inquiry of the fish speaker schools has its origin in a long-forgotten crisis. Knowledge of the events surrounding the millennia called the Scattering, and subsequently the great integration that followed, is critical to understand the people of that ancient time. The discipline of the Spice Dreamers and their ability to reconstruct and disseminate the personae of our past humanity has provided us a tool of utmost importance. Through their efforts, we have discovered a wealth of archaeological information, a temporal strata open to us that had allowed a reconstruction of what in ancient times had been called history. Remember that multiple memories and persona shifting were not common traits of our human ancestors. This fact was among the most alarming and revolutionary of all those made by the Spice Dreamers. People's minds were once solitary and alone. Sociotemperate of the Fish Speaker School, Ida Mirabla. Thunen stood alone at a podium facing a crowd that filled the great hall to capacity. The hall held over 1 million people, which made it the perfect meeting place for the first millennial celebration of the founding of the Fish Speaker Schools. But this is not what held Thunen's interest. I stand before 1 million individuals, but my thoughts are on the design of this place. The design of the great hall of the Ida Mirabla School was influenced by the original temple to St. Alia of the Ninth. Although Arrakis had been destroyed some 2,000 years before, the blueprint of the temple had been saved in a Rydillian crystal. So, as we start out in the book, chapter 1, it's 10,000 years past the original Dune book. I mean, we see here in Dune, we start out with the year 10,000. And now we're in the year 20,000. So this is several thousand years even after Chapter House. And yet, the Spice Dreamers will go ahead and remember back to the period right after following the events of Chapter House Dune. So in a way, the book's structure is, I think the books go like this. 1, 2, and 3 sort of are bookended, right? The first 3 books, Dune, Dune Messiah, and Children of Dune, fit together. Then God Emperor of Dune is sort of an island again, an island of Leto II, the tyrant. And then Chapter House and Heretics take place thousands of years after the events of God Emperor of Dune. So this book does the trick where it's the 7th book. Much of the action takes place immediately after Chapter House, completing the trilogy. But at the same time, this takes place far in the future to mirror God Emperor. And the themes mirror this way too. So what we have is the Spice Dreamers can create a consensual window through the Spice Dream back into the past that others can share. So you can see the past events, much like other memory would work for the Bene Gesserit. Oh, by the way, we're going to have a podcast talking about the origins of Bene Gesserit, other memory, and the Butlerian Jihad, also on our Pontos Fathom Press channel. I think episode 6 or 7 of our podcast. We're doing Frank Herbert Dune month, so please check out those links. So Thunen paused as he was joined at the podium by a young conduit named Yanima from the Nori Amper School. The Nori Amper School maintained a strong backbeating with the original Ixian gene pool that had been in fashion these days, which also suited the school's members to the technical expertise of large-scale spice dreaming. Anyone can learn to fold the consciousness of a few proximate people, but there were a lot of threads to track and a level of discretion to drop insignificant threads that required a spice dreamer with the Ixian background to manage such an event. As Yanima prepared for the trance, Thunen prepared the assembly crowd to receive the dream. Within moments, the place and the moment began to fade from Thunen's thoughts. Like the mundane dreams it was named for, the spice dream began to work upon its consciousness and the consciousness of the assembly. We can never experience the spice dream of another, yet we know they all coincide within the intents of the spice dreamer. As Yanima continued the process, folding consciousness, turning back the moments both from physical and psychical evidence, the million assembled individuals began to share the historical hallucination, each thought woven into the fabric of the desired target. Thunen's last thoughts before the dream were on Yanima, who is an alpha line bred directly from Hui Nori herself, her silhouette cutting the light from the sun-sweet window. She is as beautiful as was the consort of God. And then they were transported. The Gola, Paul Atreides, was alone in the courtyard when Miles Tegg entered. The boy looked around, quite aware that his progress was being watched from above by perhaps Shiana or one of the other sisters. Paul was right, of course. Shiana and Duncan Idaho were awaiting the practice session in order to monitor his progress. Duncan was outraged, and he said so to Shiana. What is the purpose of all this, Shiana? Don't go there, Duncan. We both know things are at work around us that are larger than your discomfort at training Paul. She always calls him Paul, never the Gola. When I was young, Mother Shuang Yu always referred to me as the Gola, never as Duncan. But Shiana is no longer Bene Gesserit. He watched the pair in combat training below, and Shiana turned up the listening device to eavesdrop. Paul was angry. Where is Duncan? Isn't he going to be teaching me to use the plasma weapons? Where is Duncan? I remember when the original Paul used to request my company, while I watched on with his father, Duke Leto. So many lives, and I've returned to this. As Shiana spoke to Duncan and watched Paul and Miles training below, she realized the concept of Gola never seemed natural to a Bene Gesserit. Even though they had manipulated genetic lines for so many millennia, they always allowed a natural birth from two parents. The idea of genetics engineering shared the disapproval that computers gained after the Butlerian Jihad. The technology around the forbidden field by its edicts included the computerized biotechnology. Only the Bene Tleilax practiced it, and they always denied they did, while the Bene Gesserit used conventional breeding. But it was now the second generation of Bene Gesserit sisters that were comfortable with this use of Tleilaxu axolotl tanks for custom-growing Golas. Not only had they produced their own successful Duncan Idaho, but they had also surpassed all when they produced a young Miles Tegg. The next project seemed inevitable, overseen by Shiana and her band of renegade sisters, the creation of a Gola unlike any Gola project preceding it, and they would bring back to life the strangest attractor of the ancient world. They would create a Gola of Paul Atreides. Paul cried out as Miles landed a blow. All right, lad, that's enough hand-to-hand for today. Let's move on to those plasma weapons you spoke of earlier. Miles glanced up at the observation window, and both Shiana and Duncan knew what his face told. Paul's reactions are too slow to survive. He's a relic of a past age. Duncan gazed out at Paul and sensed the strange feeling that everything he did was being watched by some unknown observer. The spice stream receded. The assembly's murmurs grew as they awaited Thunhun's response. As the din of conversation rose in the great hall, Yanima gave a knowing look to Thunen as she left the scenum. Her eyes tell me that she thinks that they're pleased with the demonstration. But will they believe the truth behind what their consciousness has just experienced for all our sakes? What we have revealed is a key, the proof for once and for all that there truly lived a man named Paul Atreides. The evidence before us is obvious. Why would the memories lie? Many have claimed the very idea of a Kwisatz Haderach was a myth constructed by the master face dancers, somehow interwoven within our very cellular memories. I offer this memory as proof that Paul Atreides did exist. Why create a twice-fallen god? The hysterical law of least probability determines that it would be absurd to create such a wild story when an imaginary man-god is fabricated and then reconstructed as a Gola who is less than his original is such a bizarre tale that it must be true. A voice from the crowd sounded, "Of course you're familiar with the idea of Gola degradation theory." Thunen explained that Gola degradation theory would not be an issue, as the dynamics of spice streaming would still be fixed to the true psychical moment of the past. As soon as this question was answered, another arose, continuing to counter the spice streamer findings. Thunen half listened as he watched the sun sweep window, and thought of the fact that it was a representation of all ancient calendars, up unto that creation. When the voice was finished, Thunen resumed his findings, letting the light paths from the grand window somehow focus and guide him. The lecture continued for some time, and after a flood of questions and personal greetings some hour later, Thunen found himself alone in the cloisters of his chambers. He reclined back in the chair where he had done most of his research. As a historian of the era that produced the integration, Thunen infrequently found himself alone in these days, and increased his interest in integration origins were due to the millennial celebrations. Even the spice dreaming could be done alone, but is more vivid in a crowd. Yanima would be along soon enough with the others from the students of the Ida Mirabla school. Thunu would get back to the Tleilaxu memories, which were where his current priorities lie. The Tleilaxu memories are not history. They are key to all of our futures. Okay, so that's a little insight into Dune Revenant. If you like what we're doing here, please like and subscribe. Check out the link to pick up a copy of Dune Revenant for your pay for the printing and shipping of it, donation. And also check out our Patreon to support the channel. I will be doing a full read-through of Dune Revenant in the Patreon, so please check out there and check out our other podcasts. For Dune Month, we are doing Dune and Psychology, Origins of the Bene Gesserit and the Butlerian Jihad, even some interesting insights into what Frank Herbert was up to with this transhuman / projection of futurism. So thank you guys for watching, and see you in the next video, and looking forward to continuing the conversation in the comments below and in Patreon. So take care and bye-bye.